The deep woods can be very terrifying, nightmare-inducing even. You don't know if it's gonna be Bigfoot rattling some trees, or if it's gonna be a Wendigo slapping up that skinwalker. The deep woods, safe to say, hold many mysteries and stories. And once again, I'm going to be sharing some allegedly true and creepy stories from the deep woods sent in by viewers just like you. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, be sure to submit them at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. Stories like yours that help keep this show going on a daily basis. Let's jump right into these allegedly true and downright strange deep woods horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. Labor Day Camping Trip Gone Wrong by Jera F. Hey Swamp Dweller, I've become a pretty big fan of your podcast and wanted to send you these stories. I did not personally experience this, but my parents did. My parents were camping at a campground that I grew up going to, called Boggs Creek. At the time, it was Labor Day weekend of 1996, and my parents set up camp to enjoy their long weekend off. Everything went well until Sunday, when everyone started to pack up and leave. My parents decided to stay an extra night and would leave that Monday since they didn't have to be at work until Tuesday. My parents noticed everyone else was going, so later that day they drove through the campground and literally saw no signs of anyone else. Everyone had left. They were the only two in the area. Late that Sunday night, they were sitting around the campfire, eating supper, and suddenly felt that they were being watched by someone or something. Shortly after, they heard what sounded like someone chopping wood across the creek. They stopped and shined a light in the woods, but they saw nothing. At about that time, they heard something or someone letting out a horrifying scream that sent shivers down both of their bodies. Right then, my dad told my mom that he would stand guard with his pistol while she packed up the campsite, and they were leaving that night ASAP. My mom packed up the whole camp and put it in the cars so fast that they held lanterns in their lap as if they were still hot when they left. They drove about a mile down the road and pulled over to put the lanterns in the back as they were cooled off. They never knew what was out there across the creek in the woods, but they knew something or someone was. Another story is that my dad was canoeing down the Etowah River in Georgia with a few family friends. They left their vehicles at the exit point, and another friend drove them up to the drop-off entry point, and they were going to float down the river to their cars. They were sailing along for a few hours, and suddenly it darkened quickly. As they floated down the river trying to reach the exit point, they heard something walking along the riverbank. They could listen to the sound of snapping tree limbs, and whatever it was sounded big. They got creeped out, hurried down the river, and went under a bridge. After they passed the bridge, they were coming up to the exit to get out, and about that time, they heard what sounded like something snapping a rather large tree limb in half. Whatever it was, let out a loud holler near the bridge as well. It did not sound human. They exited the water, found their vehicles, loaded their gear, and quickly left. They didn't go back for a long while after that. They think it might have been a Bigfoot, but nobody is for sure. Swamp Dweller, thank you for taking the time to read these creepy experiences. North Georgia mountains are beautiful, but hold many weird and unexplainable things. Backyard Camping Nightmare by BathtubJen. Hi, I grew up in southern New Hampshire and had some exciting times in East Derry. I grew up on a cul-de-sac with a police captain and a detective as my neighbors. Many weird and strange things happened while living there, most connected to the house. I had this type of shadow person. It would take shape of my family members, and years after moving from that house, my older brother would tell me, whatever it was, it liked you. Which brings us to one of the many stories I have to share with this show. My best friend lived 5 houses from me, and her parents owned a pop-up camper. Their yard was right up onto some woods. It was located on the side of their house, with a door the family used as a main entrance. Being the young 12 to 14-year-olds we had many sleepovers, with other kids in the neighborhood, of course. We had a few experiences, and I'll tell you the most haunting one. This night, it was just her and I messing around the yard on the edge of the woods. We're both girls, At that age, we would bicker over the dumbest things. This night, it was her throwing a piece of gum at me and it getting lost between the mattresses and the lining of the camper. She wasn't willing to give me another piece, leading us to butting heads. We were bickering back and forth about her giving me another piece when we both went dead quiet. Suddenly, we heard what sounded like footsteps coming out from the woods and slowly circling the RV. Then came some unintelligible talking. I don't really know how to describe it other than it was like right outside of our window, but it still sounded like it was far away. It was definitely a man's voice and we could not make out what was being said. It almost sounded like it was in another language, gibberish if you will. We looked at each other with concern, and I remember her taking off her socks. They were fuzzy and new, and she didn't want to get them ruined when running away. It was just us making the 15-foot sprint to the side door of the house, inside and up the stairs to her room while grabbing the house phone on the way. Her parents were unfortunately drunks at the time, so we didn't feel like waking them. Instead, we did the only rational thing and called my house. My mom ended up driving around the neighborhood 2 times, only to call us back and tell us that she saw nothing. We were so freaked out that we slept on the floor beside each other. Where we slept was under the window that overlooked her front yard, and I'm unsure when we fell asleep, but we both remember hearing raking and digging before we did. This is a story going on almost 20 years ago now. I am to this day still friends with my childhood best friend. If I ever tell this story or other ones that happened and someone doubts it, I can definitely try my best to get them to share their side of the story. A lot of weird stuff takes place in Derry. I know this wasn't the creepiest story in the woods, but honestly I gotta tell you, it's something that made me very wary of going out in the woods alone or even in general. The Thing in the Woods by Anonymous. When I was very young, we lived in this tiny town, I guess you could call it. It honestly only had 3 streets, 2 street lights, and about 50 houses total. All of the town kids would get together and play pickup games of baseball and such during the summer months. This particular evening, after the sun went down, we decided to play laser tag. There were about 10 of us, and all of us had our own set of tag vests and laser guns. We basically took over one section of the town and would run through the yards, hide behind garages, run in the woods, all the good stuff. Anything we wanted to do. We split into 5 teams of 2. It was with my stepbrother at the time, Ryan, who was on my team. As I mentioned earlier, there were 3 main streets in this town and lots of alleyways. One of the streets was the easternmost street, and it was bordered by a marsh and some woods on one side of the homes on the other. Ryan and I were running down this street, thinking we had seen one of the other teams running through a yard. We were going to block them in and shoot them, so Ryan and I split up. He went west and I stayed on the eastern road bordering the woods. This was a scary road at night, if I'm honest with you. The houses are a little dilapidated on the left, and the woods on the right have some ruins of old farmhouses scattered throughout them. The marsh attracted a lot of frogs and other animals, so it was always very loud. I continued walking along and soon became distracted with the cracking of twigs and leaves from the woods. My heart started to race, and I was frozen in fear. I just couldn't move, though. I looked to my right, and there was an old, dead tree, and I swore that just for a second, I saw movement behind the trunk. I stared at it, waiting for it to move again. I saw the dark, tall figure lean its head around the trunk of the tree. I could not see any features in detail because it was nighttime, but I could make out the dark, solid figure. It was standing upright. This told me it was indeed time for me to skedaddle. I ran home, stayed inside for the rest of the night, and I didn't even bother telling my stepbrother. He later came in mad at me because I abandoned him. Today, I wonder if this was the same thing that chased my dad when he was a kid. I will have to share his story in the future, but for now, I'll leave you with that little bit of a cliffhanger. Evil Woods by Abby K. Hey there, Swamp Dweller. It's been a long time since I've sent in a story here. This story is supposed to be very short, but due to some details I don't want to leave out, it might be a little bit longer than intended. Anyways, here it goes. This happened when I was in high school, sometime around 2011 or 2012. I went to a boarding school, and the school was located at the countryside, if I may say. From the side of the boys' dormitory is nothing but forest, miles and miles to the horizon. We all knew the school was very haunted, and no one ventured into those woods, be it daytime or nighttime, although some stubborn ones would try to go out there and face their fears, but they would always live to regret the decisions. This is the story of one of those guys. Let's call him Max. Max was seen as those athletic type guys, big body, tall, you know what I mean. He's always said there was nothing in those woods and he can spend the night there, blah blah blah. He got on a bet with a friend at around 11 p.m. He set off to spend the night there apparently, all alone. But about an hour or so later, his screaming could be heard. He screamed, "Jesus!" Everyone was scared to follow up, so they contacted campus security, and about 8 of them came out there and looked for him. They found him, but he was completely unconscious. To this day, 5 or 6 years later, Max has lost the ability to speak, and whatever he saw has affected him psychologically. No one knows what he saw, and no one is ready to go follow up and go into those woods to rewrite history. Well, not yet at least. To my main story, one night, obviously midnight, a friend, Mike, woke up and started calling us to come see something. We all sleep in bunk beds in the dormitory. His was right by the glass window, so he could see outside rather well. We went to his bed, and what we saw, I still can't really understand. It was a giant ball of fire. They were a few feet apart, at least 100 meters between the trees. The flame fire thingy was just bouncing from one to another like it was no one's business. We looked for quite a few minutes until the fire eventually disappeared, and we all went back to bed entirely confused. I tried to watch it again on several occasions, but it never really happened anymore. I would stay up all night. Sorry if this doesn't make much sense. I wanted to be sure to get this story into you because it's so anomalous and makes no sense to me. What happened to Max in those woods? I don't think we'll ever know. Why did he lose the ability to speak? Was it just some health condition he already had, or did something more happen? Also, what the heck was that fireball bouncing tree from tree? None of this makes any sense to me the more I think about it. I discovered something horrific in the forest by CreepyTexan. Hello, Swamp Dweller, my name is Garrett, and I'm going to share with you and the people of the swamp the time my good friend Robert and I encountered something very frightening in our local forest. It has been almost 3 years since it occurred, and I still wonder how I'm still alive to tell the tale. Anyway, here it goes. It all started on a fantastic October evening in Texas. My friend Robert and I were wondering how to spend this evening on a Saturday night. So, being the thrill seekers we were, we decided to go on a walk in our local forest and do some urbex exploring since there were some abandoned buildings in that area. I'm not sure of the history behind these buildings, but apparently they were a part of some sort of old settlement from the mid-late 1800s that was mysteriously abandoned in the 1920s. I have tried to ask more about the history from people in our small town, but for some reason they refused to talk about it. Additionally, they warned all the other teenagers and myself to not go into that forest at night. But of course, being the cocky young teenagers we were, Robert ignored that warning and explored the buildings. Once we all got our stuff packed in our backpacks, including my newly gifted camcorder, we set out for the forest at about 6:45 p.m. and got there at about 7 o'clock, so the sun was pretty much gone at this point. Once we got there, the parking lot only contained one other vehicle, a Ford Expedition. This seemed a bit odd as it was nightfall, yet there were still some hikers out and about in the park. Not that it was strange for us to be there so late in the day, but I just shrugged it off quickly and started recording on my camera once we began our 30-minute hike to the abandoned buildings. The walk went entirely normal for the most part, until we got about 10 minutes away from the settlement. It started with the crickets and other animals going quiet all around us, which I know means a predator is normally nearby. I am somewhat of an avid hunter, so I guess I would know this, as well as listening to horror stories on YouTube. Robert and I were on edge, but we refused to turn back. Instead, we slowed down our pace and minimized the number of times we would use our flashlights, since we did not want to give away our position so easily. Eventually, we made it to our destination with no further interruptions. In front of us, we were greeted by a building that seemed to resemble an old church with what appeared to be tiny houses and maybe a couple of stores surrounding it. Of course, the buildings were so old and ran down that it was honestly hard to tell what they could have been. Strangely enough, the church appeared to be in the middle of the settlement. Now, I don't know if it's just me, but if you see an abandoned town with an old, creepy church, chances are some terrible crap is going to go down. Robert and I agreed that we should probably check the buildings to make sure there are no squatters or anything. We wanted to save the church for last anyway because it was the most uneasy. We spent about 30 to 45 minutes exploring the different buildings with no interest other than some cryptic messages engraved in the wood of the building, which read out like, "We must leave before it's too late and they always watch." Now, if the town's eerie atmosphere wasn't enough to freak me and Robert out, the creepy silence that seemed to follow us around definitely was enough to make us crap ourselves, especially with the previous settlement history. Could this be connected to the town's abandonment? What were they so afraid of? There were so many questions that needed answers. I had to keep going. After exploring the last building before the church, we took maybe 10 breaths each before entering the church. Upon entering the church, it immediately made us gag with the smell of what I can only describe as pure death, and it seemed to be coming from the room below the building. A basement. That's what I could only assume. A trap door followed by a ladder led down to a secret room, and as we made our way down, that horrible smell seemed to get even more robust. We even had to use our jackets as makeshift gas masks. Once we all got down, we were met with a vast catacomb-like room with some sort of object in the center, illuminated by a dim candle hanging from a ceiling. Me and Robert were very reluctantly making our way toward the thing with my camera still recording to discover that it was half of a person's bloody body. A female that seemed to be in her mid to late 20s, very possibly a young urban explorer like Robert and myself. We both threw up upon seeing this gruesome sight. It was worth mentioning, too, that while we were down there, we never used our tack lights to see what we were surrounded by, so we both opened up our lights. I almost fainted on sight when we saw that there was maybe 20 horrifying-looking humanoid creatures surrounding us. They were probably no taller than us. They were naked, skinny, with long, thin, and wiry hair coming down from their chests. Their eyes were black as night, and their gaping mouths were dripping with blood. Their fingernails looked like they were overgrown and shaped like steak knives. They resembled the clown from Saw, except without the makeup. The hair was much thinner, and once they all knew we saw them, they all, in unison, gave this deathly shriek, a shriek that I believe could be heard in any nightmare. I didn't even know a living thing on this planet could produce that noise until this very moment. But then Robert yelled at the top of his lungs, "Run!" As we both climbed up the ladder in record time, it was an absolute miracle that not me or Robert got dragged down by those horrific creatures. We made it to the church as fast as we could and slammed the door behind us. With the screaming still being heard, we took a minute to catch our breaths as we discovered, with our lights, probably 50 different eyes coming from all the buildings we had previously explored. Upon seeing this, we bolted out of the entire settlement. I dropped my camera behind me in the process. I know, cliche, but I didn't realize this until many, many minutes. In about 10 to 15 minutes, we made it back to my truck with the Ford Expedition still there. We could now safely recollect and calm down from our horrific experience. We then concluded that the car belonged to the girl killed by those things under the church. It was a miracle that we made it out, but unfortunately she didn't, and my heart goes out to her family. The next day we led police to the location and they found her body right where we saw it. Only this time those creatures were not there. She was eventually identified as 26-year-old woman Chloe Becks. We tried telling the police our story, but they did not buy it, except for one, Sheriff Walker, a 60-year-old native of our small town. During the investigation on the site, he came up to me and Robert and said, "Now you know why we tell you not to go into the forest at night." My House in the Woods by Jason S. Back in 2013, I was visiting my cousins at their house in the small town of Buena Vista, Virginia. I would go there fairly often, as it was only 2 hours away from my own house. This wasn't your average house, though. It was on a 50-acre plantation built in 1742. All around the house were flat fields followed by dense sections of woods. At the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains, you can hike up from the backyard to the Appalachian Trail, which I often did. Because of how old the house was, it came with a big book telling its story. Lots of history there, but I'll let you know about one thing that happened there in particular. During the Civil War, right past the woodline, a local militia got into a 45-minute skirmish with Iroquois Native Americans from Delaware, traveling through the area. As a result, 17 natives and 8 militiamen were killed in that backyard. If you want to know more, look up the Balcony Downs Massacre. You'll understand why this is relevant in just a few minutes. I was sleeping in my cousin's room, with whom I am very close. She was asleep in another room that night with my younger sister. Her room was the slave room. This was a very old plantation home, and at one time they unfortunately owned slaves. The room is square, and it's the only room between the bottom and top floor. There was a small wooden spiral staircase going up into the room in the corner across from where I was sleeping, and in front of the bed was a 3 or 4 step staircase going to the top floor. Her bed was in the back right corner if you were standing on those stairs, and the spiral staircase was in the tight left corner about 10 feet over. I was 12 years old at the time, so I always saw things that looked like figures, and they always ended up being a towel or something different. Finally, because of my previous experiences, I turned my flashlight on, and what I saw made my heart drop. I saw what looked like a little Native American girl in a long dress with very long, straight black hair. She was standing there, not moving, just observing me. This scared me so bad, I just hid under my covers, too terrified to yell for anyone. I was afraid doing so would anger her or something. I remember looking up what to do if you see a ghost while under blankets. I was petrified. There was no other way to put it. I don't think I've ever been so afraid in my entire life. After about an hour, I eventually did fall asleep from exhaustion, but only for a little while. When I awoke again, I decided to peep out of my covers and check again. And there she was, in the same place, still staring at me. I then took a picture of her, but my phone screen showed no one or anything in that spot. This confirmed to me that she had to be a spirit. I hid under my covers until morning. She was gone once the sun appeared. I talked to my cousin shortly after, saying I saw a ghost in her room. She then asked which one I had seen, describing the exact girl to me, and then she described a tall black figure who stood at the foot of her bed. She told me that most nights she sees them, but I was the first to see one other than her. I asked why she didn't move rooms and why she stayed there, and she did eventually, but she said that she'd just gotten used to it. I asked her about this over Snapchat the other day, and she said, yeah, that house is definitely off and I'm never going back there again. Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true deep woods horror stories sent in by viewers just like you. Now, these stories today were definitely strange, a lot of them based in that paranormal realm. I'd love to get your thoughts about what you think is happening in those woods all around the world. As always, if you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to slap that like button, as it helps me out a ton. The more likes this episode gets, the more YouTube promotes it, and that's incredibly helpful for the swamp to grow. If you're new, why not join us? Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a new episode. I upload them damn near every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, whether it's a deep woods story, an encounter with a cryptid, or something different, I'd love to see it. Be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'm always looking for brand new stories to share on this show. If you're on the go but still want to listen to your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories, no matter where you are, you can download them absolutely free from Apple Podcast, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere else you find your favorite podcast online. It's absolutely free and always will be. If you made it all the way to the end, I'd love to know what story tonight was your favorite. The code word tonight is wooden spider. Be sure to comment that down below to let me know you made it to the end and to confuse anybody who doesn't. Anybody who makes the funniest comment will be pinned at the top. I really appreciate you all so much for supporting the swamp the way you do. I couldn't do this on a daily basis without you all. I'll be back very, very soon with some more creepy stories for you all, and I'll see you soon.